Welcome to the Hybrid Performance Podcast number 9. What I do on this podcast is discuss topics ranging from strength and conditioning, athletic performance, MMA, martial arts and fight tactics, and overall health self-care. My goal with this podcast is to share with you guys the tactics and information that I use with high-level athletes in order to improve their performance and make it accessible, digestible, and applicable to general population members, including recreational athletes, hobbyists, enthusiasts, as well as other coaches that want to use and share this information with their clientele and teams. The core idea behind the hybrid training philosophy that I use is to be able to approach your physical fitness regimen through more of a strength and conditioning based framework rather than a more typical narrow bodybuilding lens, so that you can truly upgrade your human ability and capacity across all spectrums to the level that you want to reach and maintain it for as long as possible. What this is going to tend to consist of is I'll cover 1 or 2 subjects of the month, usually that are backed by popular demand from you guys on the Substack and social media, and then I'll riff on them completely off the cuff. I do this entire podcast in a single take, and then I'll just finish with a tertiary segment, which is usually a question and answer series that you guys also provided to me on social media and on the Substack. We'll go over what the topics are for this month before we go into some announcements, and then we'll really get started. So the first thing that we're going to cover today are actually Southpaw tactics. I get requested to talk about this all the time, and normally with the Substack, I like to write lengthy, comprehensive posts that don't really hold a lot of information back. I want them to be detailed, and I don't want them to be surface level, watered down info. This means they take a little while to build, and I'm working on a lot of other projects right now, which we're going to get to in a second. So I figured the easiest place that I can really deliver this to you guys is just on the podcast here. So what we're going to go over today are Southpaw versus Orthodox stance matchups, the open guard or open stance position, parallelogram versus trapezoid shapes, the lead hand side claustrophobic hand fighting that often occurs during Southpaw exchanges and why that's important, long range rear hand blows, why those tend to show up the most and why you need to pay attention to them, how space and time changes during Southpaw exchanges, and then the leading rear hand blows and counter combinations that people tend to rely on as well, why all these things happen, how they integrate with each other, and just give you some general sauce of information of what you need to pay attention to and think about whenever you're in that Southpaw ortho position, whether you're the Orthodox or the Southpaw fighter. We're going to talk about some of the mythos of Southpaw fighters as well, some of the common misunderstandings, and we'll just riff on that and provide you a sauce of information to play with in your training. After that, I'm going to cover an ATG system, knees over toes guy review. I don't really like talking about other people's systems, especially if it's negative, really, to be honest, although occasionally I kind of have to do it. We all do. But I've been requested this a million times as well, and I'm trying to get these things out of the way on the podcast because this is what you guys are asking me to help you with. So I figure I'll cover the good with the system, the things I think that it's positively contributed to the community, and also some criticisms that I think are fair, talking about the limitations of the system, why it tends to help some people and not others, what those blank spots might be and how you can fill them in. And ultimately, humbly speaking, where this is going to lead you to is just why I use my philosophy and why you might want to use the hybrid training philosophy rather than the knees over toes ATG philosophy, just because this former one is a little bit more robust than the latter. So respectfully, we'll go through those things. But before we get started, I'm going to make a few announcements based on what's coming up and what I've been working on this year and what I'm delivering to you guys next. So what I've been building all year is an update to the program templates on the Substack. I've mentioned several times I wanted to get you guys onto an app this year, and a lot of people have been asking me about it in the meantime. I know it's been taking a while, but I want to do this right, and I want it to be really good. This is going to be the Hybrid 2.0 system. What I'm referring to it is officially the Hybrid Athlete Elite Performance Program. It's going to be on an app as a group training system using the most updated info based on what has worked best with all my custom one-on-one clients. It's going to have direct access to me and the best information possible in terms of training for general physical preparation on the internet that you can get short of a full one-on-one coaching relationship. Video and technical advice is going to cover training tutorials from all the strength and conditioning related exercises required, as well as some MMA, striking, jiu-jitsu related content specific to my extensive experience. As the Substack is an educational platform meant to inform you guys on how to organize or make decisions with your training, you can see by the length and detail in my essays that I don't really hold back very much, and I don't want to water things down. However, for that reason, for those that wanted to also have those concepts, tactics, and templates provided over the last year and a half designed for you, so you can just train and get the premium physical performance-based results in strength, speed, power, endurance, mobility, durability, etc., so you can engage with any physical task like an elite specimen, it's going to all be organized for you here. I should mention it's not a program for babies. You're going to have to work hard. But the system uses concepts that I've written about to make recovery strong, and by extension, you'll make progress that other programs can't give you while still working very hard. And if you do the work, what I can promise you is this program is going to fucking change you. If you're used to running typical bodybuilding bro splits, this is going to be very different, and you're going to feel and move extremely differently than what you're used to getting out of a typical gym routine. As it's developed, there'll be more than one program you can run within the group. So for those that want a truly serious one-on-one coaching relationship, you can reach out to me through email or social media message as always, but this will be the very next option that will be the best choice for those that want a more distance coaching relationship with less face-to-face pressure. You'll get updated programming every single week with video and text-based detailed instruction designed to push you towards that true hybrid athlete ideal for athletes, hobbyists, martial artists, physical preparation enthusiasts, etc. If you just want to be a weapon, this is for you. It's going to be filled with guides on how to adjust your programming to your needs if required, along with question-related access to me through the app. I want to have group competitions, training discussions, and form advice within there will be included as well. If my training philosophy has inspired you and you want to see it all organized and practice year round, this will be the best concurrent training group available on the internet. If you're interested as a listener to the podcast, I'm only mentioning this here before the formal announcement goes out. I want you to direct message me on Twitter, Instagram, or email me and just write the words hybrid performance, and I'll send you personally the initial onboard to the program at a very steep discount that will not be offered anywhere else. Those who missed this on the podcast won't be offered this pricing. And if you use it, it will be grandfathered into that price for life, and it's never going to go up for you. As the group skyrockets in popularity, the price is going to rise concurrently. So if you do want to take advantage, make sure you message me and receive a response from me as well. If you don't message me before this goes out, I won't answer or provide you access at this price. So to recap, there's a few things that I'm asking for you to do, just so I can offer this to you and so I can make the most out of this opportunity in this group, because I want it to be awesome for you guys. What I ask is that you message me on any social media platform, be it Substack, Twitter, Instagram, etc., or email me. Write the words hybrid performance and then provide me an email that you will actually respond to when I send everything out. Make sure also that you're subscribed to the Substack. I'll leave a link in the description if listening to this on another platform besides Substack. And then a screenshot of a comment on the YouTube post, Substack post, or a Twitter post, and I'll link those posts below as well, with the words train everything. Make sure you do all of those things so that I can actually confirm that I'm going to give you this offer, and then we'll go through with it. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. I want it to be the best thing that I've ever put out since I started this online training sphere. I'm really excited to do it, and the launch for it should be in the next couple weeks. If you guys have any questions about it, you can always reach out and ask me. I'll give you a full tutorial and maybe possibly even a tour once I release the info formally on Substack. You'll see a little tour of how I've designed it and what you can expect. Okay, so let's go into the first topic of the week, which is going to be Southpaw tactics. So there's this mythical thing about Southpaws that have always kind of evaded people's understanding but captivated their interest at the same time. And there's this concept back in the day, or not concept, but this cultural phenomenon back in the day with boxing where Southpaws were frequently avoided. Even the Rocky movies kind of mention this, where Apollo Creed is a little bit nervous to box Rocky. Not really, but people are warning him he's a Southpaw, you have to look out for that, etc. And this sort of existed back in the day. Every time someone was a Southpaw, you were told to be careful. They have secret angles, secret techniques they can get you with. It's tricky, it's different. The problem is people would just say this and have no real understanding of what any of that actually meant in practice and what decisions you actually had to make. The most deep that it sometimes got with some people is they knew, okay, don't jab, just throw your right hand. And like that was the most that people understood. And that's not even necessarily true, because that's not going to work without having the level of understanding that the actual Southpaw does of that position. So what typically happened is people would think that Southpaws, given the fact that they have an opposite stance to most people, they have these secret angles and special attacks that they can use that you can't. That makes no sense at all. And I'll explain why Southpaws have this weird advantage. It's not that Southpaws, a left-hand lead individual, or a left-hand power individual, right-hand lead. It's not that they have secret angles they can use. It's that the angles that both players now have to operate within are now also symmetrical, but it changes some of the nuances of how striking exchanges collide. And the Southpaw, being the minority, is more experienced handling those types of exchanges with tons of orthodox sparring partners, rather than the orthodox sparring partner being experienced handling Southpaw sparring partners. That's all it is. Orthodox opponents that know how to handle Southpaw fighters and are experienced with those type of exchanges, they do fantastic. They're absolutely fine. There's no disadvantage to being orthodox in that exchange, besides the fact that you might be slightly less confident in those types of exchanges and what differences are made up versus the type of openings and angles that you want to attack with an orthodox fighter. It slightly changes with a Southpaw. We'll go into some of the things that you want to think about, what those differences are, and hopefully that informs you guys on what you want to think about and change with your sparring tactics when you're in that open stance position. I should say right off the bat that an open guard or open stance, because I'm going to say that a lot, all that's referring to is a Southpaw orthodox matchup when the two individuals are in opposite stances. That's all open guard means. It's referring to the fact that there's this wide open space on the rear hand side for both people, because both legs are now on the same side in the rear, and so this wide open guard between the two. Closed guard or closed stance refers to people in the same side stance, so you kind of fit neatly together and it's easier to get close to one another. This is what I mean when I refer to the parallelogram versus trapezoid shape. So if you take an overhead view looking down on the fighters, if you have two people in an orthodox setup or you have two people in a Southpaw stance, from an overhead view, you're going to get a classic parallelogram shape where their feet are planted. If one of them is in the opposite stance, if you have an orthodox and Southpaw fighter, you're going to get a trapezoid shape. The two lead leg sides are going to be planted close to one another, and the two rear hand sides are going to be very far apart. So there's a few ways this actually affects the way they begin to exchange with one another. I'm not editing that out. No edits on this podcast. We just press forward. That's how we do it here. But with the open stance matchup versus a closed stance matchup, the closed stance allows, and I want you to keep visualizing that parallelogram versus trapezoid shape from an overhead view. The closed stance matchup involves both fighters being able to get close to one another into close range, because the lead leg of both fighters will fit into the space left by the rear leg of the opponent. So they can get very close to one another without stepping on each other's toes or colliding knees or legs. They also don't collide their hands as much because the rear hand is further back and it's on the same side as the lead hand for the opponent. So you can create this square and neatly fit into each other like puzzle pieces. When you're in that trapezoid stance, that trapezoid position from the open stance, open guard position, suddenly the lead legs and the lead arms collide into one another much sooner, and the rear side is much further apart. So what happens is the distance gets changed, because the distance at which you can now touch each other is much closer on one side and much further apart on the other side. So what you'll notice very frequently in open guard matchups is the jab hand on both fighters' lead side tends to collide, and they tend to start playing patty cake with each other, pushing each other, and they get very physical with their lead hand. You don't notice as many straight jabs, although a jab is still absolutely valid, despite many traditionalists claiming it's not as valid as a southpaw. What they really mean is the way you jab is going to have to be different, because you're no longer slicing this jab in between the guard of the closed stance matchup. So what happens is the lead hand, if you're both in an orthodox stance, that lead hand jab, you can send it out there, and from the lead side, it can fit in between the hands of the opponent, especially as you step out to the lead side. That's why many people will circle to their lead side as they throw a jab. They can take an angled opponent and flatten them out and slice their jab in between their guard, and they're always fighting for that position, circling and jabbing. With a southpaw matchup, what often ends up happening is that lead hand jab is now smothered, because as you circle out to your lead side against someone in an opposite stance, what you're circling out to is, instead of slicing in between the forearms of the opponent, you're now jabbing into their jab hand and onto their lead shoulder. There's a lot more body parts, and there's a lot more bones in the way. You don't have as clear an angle to land the shot. It's still valid. You just have to understand what differences are made in how the targets are being, how they're responding, and also what targets are available. So what you'll often see instead is that open side from the inner portion, inner angle of our stance. We'll call the inner angle is the angle towards our rear leg, and the outer angle is the angle towards our lead side. So the inner angle, you're able to get someone flat and hit straight shots in between their guard. The outer angle is safe to move towards because the other person can't hit you as easily, but they're also very protected by this shield of their lead shoulder and forearm. So what happens frequently is southpaws, instead of trying to jab and land the jab from there, they'll use their lead arm that's already very close to the opponent, and they'll get very physical with it. And not physical where they're striking you with it, but more like they're pushing and ripping your hands down, shoving you with it. And then they'll try and slip their right hand or their left hand through the guard, because their power hand is the shot that's on the side that slips through the guard very easily. So instead of jabbing through that guard, they like to throw the power shot between the guard. And both sides can do this. This is why traditionally people will say, oh, you don't want to jab a southpaw, just throw your rear hand power shot. And sometimes that works because you can slip it in between the guard with less of a setup, unlike the way you would in an orthodox or southpaw closed guard matchup. Because again, if you just throw that without a setup, the chances of you just hitting their lead forearm and lead shoulder is much higher if they're in a bladed stance. With a southpaw orthodox matchup, both sides have these cannons lined up, but at a very long range. So they're much further away from one another. The rear hand shot, it is further away from one another. So you both have these cannons lined up, but you have to time the shot much better. And the reason why is because there's much more distance. And this is what I mean by space and time. When there's more distance between the two of you, it takes longer for you to close the gap. And when space ends up creating more time for someone to react, counters are easier to implement. So it becomes a game of who can land that rear hand shot very frequently, more easily. And so they're both playing this game, and typically when it's a game of playing and timing those positions and those blows, the southpaw is more experienced doing that and playing that sport rather than playing the circling and jabbing game that many traditional boxers are using. And so the southpaw tends to get the advantage in those exchanges. That's the mystique of southpaws. And this is a very rough, a lot of people that know what they're talking about are going to say there's more to it than that, because there is. And we're going to cover some of those as well. But that's the basic intro to the mystique of the southpaw explained. Like, that's really what's going on. When people just say these things about southpaws with secret angles and whatnot, it's not secret angles. It's just different positions between the lead and rear hand side, and that affects timing and openings that you're going to strike someone with, and it becomes a slightly different game. Certain combinations, certain blows and tactics don't work quite as well because the openings aren't there, and then other openings are there that are normally closed off. You're playing a different game. Southpaw is more experienced because they're a minority. That's it. That is the mystique and the advantage of the Southpaw. There is no other Southpaw advantage that exists. If you are equally as skilled and experienced in that position, in the open stance position, as an orthodox fighter, you're at zero disadvantage. There's nothing better about being a Southpaw there, except for in practice, there's probably less of you out there. And nowadays, people are trying to train both stances, so it's a little bit less of an advantage anyway. But ultimately, there's no real Southpaw advantage besides skill. For those of you that are grappling educated, you'll probably be familiar with the 50-50 position with leg locks in jiu-jitsu. And it's called the 50-50 position because as your legs are entangled, you both have a 50-50 chance. There's no positional advantage between the two of you. Where a lot of people who have done well in the last 5 years, specifically the Danaher squad is obviously infamous or famous for this, where they gained their advantage and wrecked people with them was simply that they were experts in the position. Not because that position granted them an advantage. The only advantage they had was experience, not that the position itself was unbeatable. You're technically in an even squared position. Same with the open stance guard. There's no advantage that a Southpaw has on you besides they probably are more experienced. So I reiterate that just because so many people need it beaten out of their heads that you don't need to become a Southpaw. You don't need to be nervous around a Southpaw. You don't need to feel like your game is ruined. You just need to learn how to deal with them. So, last thing we'll kind of mention is the lead hand fighting, long range rear blows, and leading with the rear hand. These are some just basic concepts. So, with the hand fight, what you should study, I think Giorgio Petrosian in kickboxing is like a tremendous study on this. But the hand fight from the lead hands is tremendous. Another example of this in MMA is Johnny Hendricks versus Robbie Lawler. If you watch those fights, those are also great MMA-related studies in hand fighting. You'll watch them actually paw their lead hand out all the time. And they're fighting for position by trying to pull the lead hand down, move it, push them away, and it may seem subtle and more like an annoyance that doesn't really do anything, but the reality is, one, an annoyance does do something. It breaks people's rhythm, focus, and their ability to get into position where they comfortably feel balanced to throw their own shots and safe to throw their own shots. Pulling someone's hand down in front of them and exposing their face immediately wants them to flinch and pull their hand up. They're thinking about where they're vulnerable, not necessarily where they're going to hit you. And just by touching the guy and exerting control over them, you're starting to gain initiative. They're starting to react to you instead of you react to them. So you'll watch a lot of Southpaw matchups where there's a lot of touching, pushing, and pulling. And if you're wondering why that's happening and you're saying they're just playing patty cake, why aren't they punching each other? It's because that lead hand play, it's harder to land the jab with force. Instead, what's in the way as a target is just the other person's lead hand. So they're pushing and shoving it away from each other, trying to gain that position. In that fight, what they're trying to do at the same time very frequently is time and find position to throw the rear hand and slice it in between their guard. So there's two ways this typically happens, and we're going to talk about Conor McGregor for a second because I've written and I'll post. I have a pretty popular thread I wrote a while back that still gets a lot of attention. That was actually why I was asked to write about this. And I wrote it on Conor McGregor and how he used his positioning and how he basically made $1 million fighting. I break down the system of his fights. I break down how he was successful and when he was successful and why he was successful. And I also illustrate the times he wasn't successful and when he gets beat and why that didn't happen. It's because that system was disrupted before it got to its end game. So I suggest reading that, going over it, but I'll summarize a few concepts here. If you look at Conor McGregor, especially the Eddie Alvarez fight, you know, it's a shame he just kind of lost his passion for the game after 2016 because he was genuinely so good. He was getting so good at that point
that he almost seemed magic. Like he didn't even seem real at that point for MMA related striking. He looked against Eddie Alvarez the way that Anderson Silva looked against Chris Lieben and Forrest Griffin. Like, he was amazing. Just another level. Against other elite strikers in striking sports, they might be able to perform similar things, but in MMA, incredible stuff. And I've been hard on him for a while because I just talk about how he's done. He doesn't want to do this anymore. He's not the same, because I don't think he's the same guy. But sometimes we're so harsh on him the last few years that people are underestimating just how good he actually was, because he wasn't just legit. He was like mythically good, especially that night in New York. And Eddie Alvarez is like a tailor-made matchup for him, to be fair. And I'll explain why. So Eddie has a lot of nice little tricks in his pocket that he built his career on that I think are cool. One of them is he was actually known for leading with his rear hand very frequently in any matchup. And he had these little footwork tricks and ways that he would set it up and time it. Like Southpaws and the open stance matchup like we just mentioned, that could potentially work really well. It could also spell disaster. And the reason why it spelled disaster against McGregor is because you'll notice when they're fighting, he's reaching his lead arm out a hell of a lot. He reaches his lead arm out, he's grabbing Eddie's hand, he's pawing it down, he's putting a hand in his face. He's not jabbing him with it all the time. He's just getting physical and bothering him with the thing. That doesn't work as well in the orthodox or southpaw closed guard matchup, because if you just stick your lead arm out all the time, overhands and rear hand blows will loop over that shoulder or stab into your gut very easily because you leave that opening. But when you have your rear hand side further back, far away from the opponent, you have all this space and time to react when you see it. So it's a little safer to leave the lead arm out because you're not exposing that end that you're extending your arm out from to the power shot from the rear hand side. So it's a little safer. You have more time to deal with it. McGregor handling the distance, keeping himself at the right space, that he knows, okay, well, what I'm afraid of, or the only thing I have to worry about with Eddie is him throwing that right hand, and he's throwing it from 10 miles away. So I'm going to see it and react to it before that's a real problem. And so he's sticking it out there, and what he does is he's bothering, touching Eddie, poking him, kicking him, landing a couple light shots, trying to pull him forward to commit to that right hand. The second you see Eddie get desperate, not sure what to do, he goes to his bread and butter. All right, what are you supposed to do? You just throw a right hand against a southpaw. It's just like throwing a jab, low risk. That's what you do, right? And when you're in this position, wrong. He throws the right hand, gets absolutely buckled because McGregor pulls and pull counters, lands his own left hand, cripples him. Devastating knockout. It looked like a work of art. It's awesome. People still watch it to this day, and you can still look at it now, and it's awesome to watch. It's so, I'm not trying to be overly poetic, but it's like a beautiful thing. And you see him just absolutely buckle him with a combo. What was that? Why was he ready with this 4-piece combo right there and didn't throw it a second prior? Because the lead hand play, pushing, pestering, and pushing and prodding against Alvarez prompts him to lead with his rear hand at the wrong distance at the wrong time. McGregor takes a small step backwards, pulling his head back just enough, and then sticks his own rear hand shot, that long-range cannonball lined up. Once Alvarez stepped forward and missed, now he's in the perfect range for Conor to counter and just absolutely snipes him. Conor built his entire career off of this. Never really scored a knockout against any high-level guys doing anything but that. Obviously, he did the same thing to Aldo. Did the same thing to Marcus Brimage when he first burst onto the scene. The only high-level guy he got with a left hand coming forward was Mendez, and that was for a different reason. And if you want to learn more about why that happened and where he struggled, you can read that thread that I'll post below on Twitter. It has a bunch of pictures, videos, GIFs. It gets very in-depth on McGregor's style and system for winning. But essentially, that's the southpaw matchup. You need to be aware that you have the lead side is closer to one another. It's harder to get closer to one another because those lead the lead sides begin to collide, your knees get in the way of each other, people step on each other's feet all the time, which is a valid tactic, by the way. The kicks on the lead side are closer to one another. We haven't even addressed those. The power kick from the rear hand side is lined up with one person's liver, which is great, but for the other side, it's lined up with their spleen because they have a different side of their body and anatomy facing forward and to the rear side. There's a lot of little things that we could cover, and perhaps at some point I'll cover more of this, but hopefully this was like a useful little intro to the concepts behind Southpaw tactics and why it's different, and it's not something that's like this magical Southpaw angle that no one has. Every single angle advantage that McGregor has, Dustin Poirier had the exact same angles. He was just better at selecting the shots and better at seizing those positions than McGregor, and he did outbox him. So understand that, play around with those things, and maybe we'll do another podcast. I'm hoping to have some guests on here, and I have a couple friends of mine that are very skilled strikers and knowledgeable. I'd love to have them on to talk about stuff like this, especially when we have a relevant fight coming up. So that would be cool. McGregor's fighting later this year. Might be interesting to have someone on before that just to talk about a few things related to it. Okay, so let's jump into the ATG knees over toes guy review. Again, I should say I don't want to sound overly critical. I'm just giving you an honest review of what it is that they preach from what I see. I'm going to try and be as objective as possible and give you the best information possible outside of my own self-interest so that you just have the best understanding and the best takeaways that you can use to improve yourself and make the best decisions with your training, as I'm always trying to do with this stuff. But it's harder to do when you're kind of looking at other people's stuff that may have certain implications behind it that you don't think of. But let's start off with the good stuff. What I really think he did great with when he first burst onto the scene was the concept of training at range and using deep joint angles. Right off the bat, that's the obvious thing. But it's the whole knees over toes thing. Like the idea that you can actually bend your joints deeply and train them heavy at those ranges, and it's not inherently dangerous. It's in fact desirable. The idea that he's advocating or encouraging people slowly, within reason, to work higher stress positions that we've frequently, especially the last 10, 20 years, maybe historically been told these are dangerous, these are bad things to do, you'll destroy your joints, you should fear these things. The word that's used for this is frequently kinesiophobia. It's the idea that certain movements and positions are inherently dangerous and you should avoid them at all costs. This is destructive to people because it makes you vulnerable. It makes you afraid of certain actions, sport movements, behaviors, and abilities that you actually were born with, most likely. And at the very least, you probably have the ability to gain if you didn't have them prior. You are now being taught to be afraid to get into positions and do certain things that you, I think, as your birthright, were born and evolved to be able to handle. The problem with many people is they don't have this capacity at the moment for XYZ reason. Could be an old injury, could be neglect, and it could be some other issue that you just didn't develop at a certain age or time for whatever reason. But the point is that these things are not inherently bad. They just need to be worked up to. I think him advocating that and bringing that to the market and into the sphere has been a positive thing. It's a major thing that I've talked about for the last few years. And if there's one thing that the ATG system has brought effectively, it is the idea of compromising positions that are high stress and training in deep ranges is a good thing and desirable. You just need to progress to it. And that's the next thing. I like that they really advocate that progressions and regressions are important. This is also a big part of my philosophy and system. Your capacity to reach a certain level of training, you shouldn't really think so much about limits. You need to really just get progressions and regressions right. Because as long as you get the progression right, you can pretty much reach any point in theory. So the idea where a lot of people run into stalls, and this is why a lot of people I think are afraid of these positions when they're afraid of putting their knees over their toes. They're afraid of a deep squat. They're afraid of, bending their spine or whatever stretched positions you're in. The reason why they're afraid of them is because those positions would probably hurt them. They probably don't have the ability to access and train them, let alone with weight. But again, the reason why they think it's inherently bad is because they don't see how you can bridge the gap to get there. And if you can get there, then you're obviously a lot healthier and safer otherwise in most cases. So it's really your ability to build a road and build a bridge to get to these locations rather than the location itself being the problem. In some cases, maybe it's very difficult and possibly not even worth getting to certain islands and locations. But there are certain ones that are certainly valuable to get to. I think being able to squat all the way down to the ground is a mark of good health, and that's something that basically all human beings should be able to do in some capacity or another. You'll probably learn to appreciate this more as you age versus if you're in your 20s and 30s, you might take for granted what you can do. But a lot of people, as they get older, they neglected these things, and in fact, they avoided them because they thought by avoiding them, they'll spare themselves damage when they're older. Turns out the neglect went too far, and they actually lost that capacity even worse than if they had exposed themselves to it to some degree. So the key to all of this is understanding the entry point, and I spoke about this on the Substack many times through the stress capacity model. You need an entry point, and then you need to know how to progress that entry point. And the thing I took from, I always use David Gray's line here, and I did on the last Substack talking about tendonitis, but I love his line that you want to be aggressive with your rehab or your training, but you want to be smart with your progressions. And what a lot of people do is they don't know how to get to a high level stress position, so they take these big jumps. You do something easy and you say, okay, cool, and then you want to jump right back into barbell back squatting heavy, and you didn't know how to bridge that gap. I digress on this. I know I'm going off on it, but that's really where people screw up. I think the ATG system did a good job of providing people some sort of framework to reaching those positions. Although I don't think it's all encompassing. Training common weak links are very valuable. That's another thing that I thought they brought to the table that was great. Training the rotator cuff through shoulder rotations, training the foot and ankle, training the hip flexors. These are things that have been in athletic development for a very long time. They're nothing new. Even tibialis raises, which have been memed to death. Even I posted about them, and then a little while later, they just got way too overrated and popular. These are a good thing. To train these parts, to leave no stone unturned. I mean, my whole thing is training everything, so you should train everything. It's a good thing to do. I think it's great that they brought attention to these things with accessible exercises that have a robust system, meaning it's easy to do, you don't need a special machine. That's a great thing as well, because people do benefit from training these things rather than just bench pressing themselves into oblivion. And then also marketing it in such a way that they're making these health and strength training concepts outside of what was commonly believed to be standard and making them mentally viable to the average person. Like, marketing this way is not a bad thing. It's effective for business, but it's also a good thing because you're pushing average people into health-seeking behavior. And some people will sometimes criticize them for saying things that might be technically untrue. And there's something to be said for that, sure. But at the same time, it's not necessarily a net negative if it is encouraging people who otherwise are uneducated to start engaging with health-seeking behavior when they otherwise wouldn't be. It's probably better if they're slightly misinformed and doing something that helps them versus if they're technically accurately informed, but they're just spending all day making Reddit posts with semantic corrections towards everyone's stuff while just eating Doritos chips and never having seen the sun in 3 weeks. So this anti-fragile mindset, essentially, that they have encouraged and sparked in the industry, or rather in the common person's mind that has been exposed to them, I think that's an unbelievably powerful thing. And I think that's ultimately the heart of what the ATG knees over toes guy system has provided that I do appreciate. However, there's no real philosophy behind it that allows flexible approaches. And I think that's partially one of my ultimate issues with it. They choose a lot of tremendous exercises, a lot of exercises that have been around for a while, a lot of exercises that I use, a lot of exercises that a lot of coaches use that we really appreciate. We know how powerful they are, but they're providing it. And part of this is because you're marketing to the average person that they just need, a copy paste approach. I get it. But for people that want a little bit more nuance to their training, that take it seriously and want to get to a high level, having a robust philosophy that allows flexible approaches and pulling you into success rather than trying to push you into, push a square peg into a round hole, that's going to set up a fair amount of people for failure. If you apply this system to 100,000 people, there's a certain number of them who will find success, and there's a number of them who won't find success. And what happens very frequently is there are holes in what the person needed, or holes in the progressions that they needed, or a certain part of the body that they haven't been training, or a contraction type that they needed that was left open through this cookie cutter approach that wasn't really granted an option for them, or they weren't educated on or guided through, because ultimately it's just this flow chart approach that's a little bit limited, and the philosophy behind it grants you no decision-making process besides do the exercises, right? And that's not how real coaching works. You'll understand this more if you're a coach that really understands the system and especially understands teaching this stuff to people. It also doesn't include a lot of comprehensive work that I really think is super important. As far as I know, they don't really show you a plyometric system. And I do think that, for people that are talking about jumping, dunking, and playing sports a lot and being resilient, the idea that they're just teaching you long-range exercises, which obviously I'm a fan of, as well as short range and progressions between the two. As a fan of those things, the fact that they're also talking about high velocity, high impulse athletic sports and not teaching you how to engage with plyometric work very well, I think that's a major weakness. They haven't shown a ton of dynamic efforts, and this doesn't necessarily mean speed squats and speed deadlifts all the time, but just general exercises that bridge past the gap of building general structure and building outputs that are more invisible rather than something you can actually measure with an MRI. And I don't really think they have good program design either. Again, I know there's some limitations where they need to make it accessible to the average person, but I think the programs that they've put out, humbly speaking, I understand when you put these things out to an extent, programs are always going to be updated. And I've updated a million things I've used to use and put out, but at the same time, they frequently changed their programming. And they changed it so much, and I followed this for a while. They changed it so frequently with almost just meaningless changes. And I think this was simply, in my, if I'm being honest with you guys, I think it's my obligation to do so. I think it was simply just to bring novelty to the consumer, to think they're getting something new and important, when really it was a meaningless change. And I think with their business model, it may have been difficult for them. They would advocate people to do 12 weeks at a time on each of their body weight to intermediate to advanced programs and then cycle back through them. There's some truth in, letting months go by for certain adaptations to settle in, because the reality is with a lot of tissue-based adaptations that aren't muscular especially, it does take a long time for them to settle in. It can take months before. I think 3 months to 6 months is actually a good time period to look at. I mentioned this on the tendonitis stack, but 3 to 6 months is a good time period to look at elastic and tissue-based qualities beyond muscular ones for them to really settle in. So it's not untrue that that's the case, but it seemed like they had a hard time getting people to stay subscribed for very long, and they had a big churn with their consumer base or customer base. And so by constantly updating the info with new things without necessarily testing them out too much or having a real reason behind it, it ended up just being kind of messy. You couldn't commit to any program. and they ended up keeping people spinning their wheels sometimes without getting anything necessarily new. And I think a lot of people would just subscribe, take the program, and dip, and sometimes not really see results because they didn't really commit to any progressions that they needed in some cases. And that's not necessarily all ATG's fault by any means, but I do think that's probably what was going on. But what happens is when people take that system and those programs, they try to apply it, they get that, underwhelming result and fail. And ultimately, I'm just trying to help people understand some things so that you don't fail, so that you're successful. I didn't like the program design overall. I don't think it had enough detail for people to really know what they're doing and avoid a lot of common mistakes. A big part of training and good coaching is helping the person avoid major mistakes that are going to cause them to fail so that they stay in the they stay on the rails of progress. It's not necessarily getting the person on the train track to move as fast as possible, although that's a good thing. A big part of good coaching is just keeping them on the track in the first place. So whether they get somewhere in 6 weeks or they get somewhere in 6 months, they're still making progress. And a lot of times that becomes things like nutrition, sleep, a couple exercise selections, things like that, coaching some form adjustments whatsoever, whatever you need. Those things tend to be the eyes that coaches need to see. They need to see where the leaks in the system are, more so than special tactics to accelerate your progress, although both are a factor. I think the ATG system didn't do this. One of the ways they tried to plug this up was having ATG certified coaches, and I'm going to criticize this for a moment as well. I don't think it's a bad thing to get a certification. I don't think it's a bad thing to get education in a system, learn someone's philosophy, and I don't think it's a bad thing to try and uplift anybody who wants to get involved in the system that they admire. But what I think functionally happens with this system is when you have an ATG certified coach, or you're just going in with their system and you have a special certified coach coaching you, that's not an individual coach. That's no different than an artificial intelligence extension of the system, which I already mentioned why it's limited anyway. So what a lot of them know is very little, and they're not even allowed, I think, to give any of their personal input on a lot of things. They can't change their mind on certain stuff. They just have to do what's officially endorsed by the company. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the case. So what happens is when you have a human being coaching you as an ATG coach, you functionally just have a human that's like a customer service agent that's going to tell you, you have low back pain, do these 3 exercises. Okay, I still have low back pain. Okay, maybe do these 3 exercises with less weight or whatever. And to some extent that is coaching, but at the same time it's very inflexible, and it gets back to the point where I'm like, they don't have a philosophy that's very flexible behind all of this. They just have a collection of exercises and progressions for them. And it needs to be a little bit more expansive than that. And there's also needs to be a touch with coaching that's personalized, knowing how to communicate to an individual. That sounds kind of cliche, but it is actually true. So when you have an ATG coach, it's like, what's really the difference between just having an AI respond to you through text message, critiquing your form slightly here and there, and maybe telling you more weight, less weight, try this variation here, etc. I guess on some level that's partially what I do as well, but they're coming at it from a place of like very limited programming to where they're barely a person as a coach. They're really like when you call a hotline and you're not talking to a person, you're really just talking to a customer service agent with a script. Like that's a nightmare in terms of coaching, in my opinion. Another thing is, to them, they preach a lot of mobility. And that's also a good thing in my opinion, but ultimately mobility in that system, to my knowledge, again, humbly speaking, is just stretching. And this isn't really true that all mobility is stretching. Understanding body control is just as important. Understanding joint function is just as important. And while they will advocate for some of the same mobility tactics that I use, which is not just stretching, but stretching under load and stretching with long range exercises, that's good. But sometimes the issue with mobility is actually the positions and the control you have over your body. You don't know how to access ranges mechanically. That actually matters. We do a lot of things with pronation drills for the foot, learning how to place your body over the midfoot position so you can actually drive through the ground and access the most range of motion at your knee and hip and your ankle. We do this all the time with people. It's important for you to learn how to do that, and you don't accomplish that with stretching. You accomplish that with good mechanics and exercise selection and coaching through those positions, so people learn how to feel those positions that they might not have kind of programmed themselves with throughout their life. So there's a lot more to mobility than just stretching with long range exercises. And I think some people might be able to get a lot of muscle length through these things, but still struggle getting into positions they otherwise could if they just knew how to position their body differently, and knew how their actual joints worked. That would do them a lot more service, in my opinion. So it's just an incomplete approach. And I'd also say that not all, it's marketed a lot to like self-rehab. Nothing wrong with this as well. I think it's a really good thing to give people great tools to help repair problems that they have when they don't go to a professional. I think it's, and the idea of progressing and regressing and knowing how to do that to some extent for the average person is a really powerful thing. But not everything is fixed with a long range movement done heavy and short range movement done for high reps, and certainly not all pain. I mean, this is a much more complex thing, and I've talked about this where there's no real such thing as being totally pain-free in life. You're always going to experience some pain. And it's not because there's anything wrong with your body either. You can have a perfectly healthy life and you'll experience some pain here and there. You might experience pain frequently even. And it might not have anything to do with the exercises that you do either. You can do certain things with your physical training to reduce the risk of pain, reduce the severity of it, and certainly reduce the risk of injury, which would increase the rate of pain. But being truly pain-free is a little bit of a myth, and the idea of perfectly pain-free performance and being bulletproof, and a lot of people are too hard on the bulletproof thing. Kind of depends on who you're talking to. Some people are so pro-bulletproof that you're like, you got to settle down. Like, there's no such thing as bulletproof. There's a limit to what you can do. You're just more resilient. And then there's some people that are so like, there's no such thing as bulletproofing, that it's like, dude, just relax. We're using the word. Even things that we label bulletproof, like armored vehicles, are not actually totally bulletproof. Like, you can break through the armor as well. It's like, just relax. Obviously, we're just using it as a term to say we're building robust resilience in a certain area. Like, let's settle down. So it kind of depends who you're talking to. But the idea is, I have had some people message me over the last few years, theorizing about how blissfully perfect they can make their body in perfect balance and perfectly strong in every capacity so they never feel any ounce of pain. And I'm like, if you're pushing your body, and if you're outside, and if you're living life, and if you're having thoughts and breathing, something at some point is going to hurt you and cause you pain, even if you're not injured. Sometimes one of the main causes of lower back pain seems to just be depression and anxiety. Like, there's nothing wrong with your spine, but your nervous system is real stressed out, and some people respond to that with joint pain. It's a real thing. Sometimes you get joint pain because of allergies. You can get joint pain to diseases that are not orthopedic in nature. You can get joint pain and other forms of pain due to the food that you consume. So not to crap on their concept of bulletproofing too hard, but the idea is sometimes people get the idea and are sold on the idea of like, if I'm experiencing any pain, I need more strength in this exercise. And the reality is, strength doesn't fix every problem with pain, and strength doesn't fix every performance problem. So I think that's essentially where I'm coming from when it comes to like, these things just have more nuance to them. And I hate to be the guy also that's like, I'm adding more nuance to my discussion on nuance, but like, I hate to be the guy that's so wrapped up in like, there's layers to it that I end up feel like I'm not really saying anything. But it is worthwhile to like understand these things so that you can take what's good from that program, like I mentioned earlier, and then not attach yourself and tie yourself down to any of the things they promote, which is just going to end up limiting you after you got the good concepts away from it. And like I mentioned, the good concepts are, progressions and regressions are an incredible thing. Positions of high stress are usually something that you can build up to. Training everything on the body and not leaving things unturned can really do you a lot of good. Sometimes the things that you don't see in the mirror are still really valuable for your well-being and performance. And it is a good thing to do something to reach health-seeking behavior rather than getting overly analytical about everything and trying to have the perfect perspective but not do things right in practice. But with the hybrid system and what I'm coining the hybrid system, maybe I'll call it something else someday. I'm doing this off the cuff, obviously. What I think the system really lacks are plyometrics, dynamic efforts, overall program design that actually covers everything. It just leaves so much to athletic performance out of the picture. It's marketed as a rehab program for your whole body and an athletic performance program at the same time. I think it's also a good thing I should add to understand that performance and rehab are the same thing. They're just on different ends of the spectrum. I also mentioned that in the Substack last week with graphs kind of displaying the concept. But at the end of the day, the program itself is lacking tons of stuff that you're going to want to have in a true comprehensive athletic performance system and a true orthopedic and joint health self-care system, which I didn't plan to say this prior, but I should say if you do want one that really is well thought out, is a generic program that you can run that's going to service the vast majority of people effectively, the Hybrid Elite Performance Program, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, message me about it. I'll give you access. I'm really excited to release it. It's going to be awesome. And in my humble opinion, it's a lot more comprehensive than what other people are putting out for the most part.
All right, so let's put out the questions for the Q&A this month. First one is talking about the DK Metcalf post. So Matt asks, DK Metcalf post was cool, interesting. Mind going into a bit more depth of some of the athletic advantages and disadvantage of one's anthropometry, long-limbed versus short, narrow, wide, etc. There's no way I could really do this justice in one quick Q&A answer. It's definitely a subject that deserves a deep dive into it, but I can cover some of the really general things and maybe some of the context behind that post and what I had been talking about last month when I put that out there. So first, the DK Metcalf post was talking about how absurd his proportions are, like his bone structure. It's easy to not realize how insane he's built. Like, his limbs are so ridiculously long and his torso's a thumb, but you actually don't realize it being as extreme as it is because he's also so muscular that, a lot of long-limbed people have a hard time filling out their frame and not looking skinny because they have to fill out like far more cross-sectional area to look big. And he still looks super jacked despite having absurd tree branch length limbs. So it just goes to show how much muscle mass is really on his frame, even if he doesn't look like Ronnie Coleman or whatever. And there's also some implications behind the structure and what he may gain and lose by having these really long limb lengths. So one thing I should cover, and I've talked about this before, and you can go too far down this rabbit hole, but the classic compression expansion Bill Hartman model where the shape of your torso might affect some of your preferred movement strategies or implications in how you organize yourself into a certain physical task. Some people have, we're just talking about the torso for a moment, some people have a more narrow rib cage, some people have a more wide rib cage. This is typically assessed by looking at the width of the ribs at the base, where if the ribs kind of come out more horizontally, you're typically a little wider, and if they kind of splay downward a little more, you're typically a little more narrow at the sides. And what you end up having from a bird's eye view is a narrow has a very circular type rib cage from above, and a wide tends to have more of an oval shape. And this has certain implications in how people tend to move. Wides are, an oval is essentially a circle that's kind of squished and compressed at the front and the back. So the circle pushes out to the sides. That's essentially what a wide built rib cage is. And for an example of someone with a wide type rib cage, you might look at someone like Eddie Hall, World's Strongest Man, basically everyone in World's Strongest Man. People that are really strong, really powerful, tend to have a wider rib cage. And the reason for this is not the reason for it, but
the implications of it is that if you have a wider rib cage, the way we breathe, we tend to have our rib cage expand and compress. And that's really where the whole expansion compression model comes from. And when we're compressing and squeezing air out of our lungs, the top of our rib cage, and the front of it rather, will come down a little bit. And you'll actually squeeze air out from the front and back that way. And so when we're producing force, we use this to help generate a ton of force and, extend our limbs. So when you do something like a heavy squat or a deadlift, you'll take a deep breath at the bottom, and then you will breathe out as you come up and as you're driving into the floor in order to produce force. And so when you're already halfway compressed naturally, just from the shape of your rib cage, one of the implications is you're already in a place of leverage to produce a lot of force, because it's almost like you're already halfway there to producing max force. It's kind of like how you can half squat more weight than you can full squat. You're already kind of halfway there. The disadvantage of this is you can't even take as big of a breath. So this can have an effect on you in the sense where your breathing mechanics and the amount of air that you can fill your lungs with might be a little bit more shallow compared to someone with a narrow rib cage and a more rounded rib cage, because they can fill up their lungs in the back of the ribs a little bit more. So oftentimes you'll see narrows do well with a lot more endurance sports, but there's also speed and, movement type qualities, and also different propulsion based strategies as well. So you might look at something like a narrow has an easier time getting their center of mass over one leg at a time. So when you're transitioning through the gait cycle and you're running, it's easier to shift laterally, because we do this very subtly as we rotate through the gait cycle. It's really small, it's really subtle. You don't think about it while you're running, but you will slightly shift your weight from one leg to another, side to side. And it's mostly eclipsed by the rotation of the movement, so you don't notice it too much, but it does occur. It's easier to do that if you're very narrow, because getting a narrow circle shifting laterally over the stance leg is a shorter distance and easier to do than if you have this very wide fridge-built torso that has to move way further to get its center of mass over each leg. So if you look at the difference between a guy like Eddie Hall and like Larry Wheels, look at that video of Larry Wheels sprinting on a treadmill. He's like stiff as a board, has difficulty rotating, and it's super difficult for him to get over each stance leg. Doesn't look right because it's not. He's not nearly as efficient with it. If you're narrow, it's easier to rotate because you're narrow, like you're a circle. Easier to rotate and twist. Easier to gain those easier to access those positions with movement. And then it's easier to get your center of mass over a leg. So as you transition through the gait cycle, you can more fluidly do it with less time and losing less momentum and requiring less muscular effort to do so. And it's less tiring. Plus, you can breathe a little bit better. These types of athletes tend to be better at like high velocity, elastic activities, partially for this reason and reasons I've covered on podcasts prior. And wides tend to be good at really muscular compressive activities. And compression's like a dirty word. Every time people hear compression, they think pain, they think injury, they think that's bad. But that's not true. We're always compressing and expanding. There's a yin to the yang. We're using both of these strategies, and one of them can't exist if the other doesn't. Like, you can't actually expand, yield, and flex a joint if you can't compress and squeeze it either. So you need to be able to do both of them. Some people just have a body type that tends to bias in one area or the other, and we haven't even gotten to the limb lengths yet, but you tend to have those two torso shapes, and the differences between them tend to really show up when you're at one end of the extreme. Most people are not going to be at one end of the extreme for the most part, but you're going to notice people who have that narrow rib cage type tend to be elastic, quick, often longer limbed athletes as well for another reason. And you're going to notice the wide rib cage athlete tends to be the guy who's just really good at just breathing out, compressing, and producing a lot of force. They tend to be strong, and they tend to be good over two legs because it's easier to actually balance over two legs and producing a really high amount of force in a bilateral position when you're wide set, right? So there's different there's a different torso shape that's going to affect your movement strategies. But then there's the limb length as well. So let's say, for example, you have very long limbs. Well, one thing is, for example, when you're sprinting, you are able to take that long limb and it works like a long tree branch or a long stick. If you swing that stick into a wall, you can put a lot of force on the end of that stick, right? Because if you swing it, it has a long distance from where you're propelling it from, and it's going to transfer all that force to the end, and you can hit the wall really hard. But if you grabbed that stick that's long and bent it in the middle, or even if you hit the wall with it, the chances of it snapping in half in the middle is also very high. So you can create a ton of leverage with these long-limbed athletes due to their build. You can leverage their leverages, but at the same time, those leverages create a lot of stress through their joints. So it's very common that people built with very long limbs are also vulnerable to destroying those limbs at the same time. So they're very propulsive, but also potentially more at risk. But because they can produce a lot of force through their leverages in certain positions, usually when you swing the limb, like it's harder to produce force if we're like extending through a squat than if you were like sprinting. So like the long limb might have an easier time putting force into the ground sprinting, but not necessarily through squatting. But if it's an elastic action, you can swing it, put tons of force into the ground, and they get the force they produce to go fast from their leverages to an extent. If you're shorter, you don't necessarily have that advantage, but your joints are also going to take the beating a lot easier, because you're naturally a little bit gentler on it. And so one thing that's really important with a lot of guys that are shorter is they're usually better at lifting because you're doing less work. Like one thing also to note with longer limbed athletes is they have to do more work through most long range of motion exercises. So if we're using a long range exercise, a long limbed athlete is literally doing more work every single rep by nature. So volumes of training and stress need to be accounted for them. So that's why a lot of times barbell lifts and other things don't feel good on them. Their joints are already beat up from their training because they might not be strong enough to handle their impacts that they can create on the ground. And then when they get in the gym, 5 sets of 5 on squat or 5 sets of 5 on the bench press, that's way more work for them than somebody with T-Rex arms, right? So you don't want to just both give them 5 by 5. Sometimes you can solve a lot of problems for them just by giving them half as many sets or 75% as many sets, because they're getting a similar stimulus from it already, just rep for rep. So you have to account for that. That's partially why a lot of tall athletes think they can't use barbell lifts or think they can't use certain exercises. It's really just that they have no understanding of the fact that they can't do the same program as a shorter build guy. Like, for example, the best bench press programs in the world are going to be put out by guys that are really advantaged in the bench press for the most part. They tend to have shorter arms. Then they put out a program based on what works for them and possibly other people like them that are successful. And then you have some guy who's, built like Jack Skellington, and he feels insecure about how his bench press is so weak, especially if he's on a football team or something. He feels like it needs to be higher for his testing and for his team to admire him and for the coaches to eye him. And so he goes on this bench press program, and he's copying what these short-limbed athletes do, and he blows his shoulder and elbows out, and they suck, and he's got tendonitis, tendinopathy, or some other issue. And it's like, that was a bad plan because you didn't realize it's not the ultimate bench press plan for anyone. That's the ultimate bench press plan for guys built like that. So a good coach needs to know how to manage stress and understand how stress affects their bodies differently, because the exercises are literally not having the same amount of effect on them. And conversely, if you're very short-limbed, a long range of motion bench press is literally a shorter range of motion for you in a lot of cases if you have very short arms. So like you might actually benefit from more volume. So a lot of guys, if you're a little bit stockier, you feel like your lifts are stalled, it's worth slowly considering like adding a little bit more volume or a little bit more work. That might actually be an advantage for you, or another setup that allows you to leverage more range of motion. Another thing too is with a lot of short athletes, I shouldn't say short because some people are tall but have short limbs. If you have a shorter limbed athlete, they're also very they're often good at lifting, so they think they're strong enough for their sport, and so they actually peel off. Like, they get the double body weight squat easy, right? And then they think, okay, I'm strong enough, because people always say that double body weight squat, you don't need to go any higher. And they're like, all right, I'm good, so how do I get faster? I got to work on elasticity, because that's what I'm missing. Just like the long-limbed guys are very elastic. And because you remember, like, that's how they produce force, through like leveraging and swinging their long limbs. The shorter guy, it's like the opposite. You actually don't want to necessarily work on their elasticity, as obviously you still want to train it, but it's like, bro, you got to double down on getting strong, because you need to actually get even stronger to make up for what you lack in these leverages when sprinting and jumping. So that double body weight squat thing for you, it came easy to you because it didn't count for as much. For you, the standard should be like 2.5 times body weight squat, maybe. And I don't really believe in these standards to be absolutes by any means whatsoever, but like, think of it that way. It's like, bro, you got to get even stronger. Like, not saying, oh, I'm already strong, so I need to focus on the other things. It's like, no, you're already strong because you're advantaged in this way, which means the muscular strength that you're producing and the force that you can produce outside of like this short range of motion that you can squat through, you need to put even more weight on the bar and be more impressive in that way, so that you can make up for what a guy built like Usain Bolt can put into the ground due to his leverages. And it's worth noting, by the way, Usain Bolt, fastest guy of all time, whatever. Most people are not built like him. Most sprinters are not built like him. Like, he's actually unusually built. He's like a narrow rib cage, long limbs. He's not the best accelerator. Like, when it came to compressing and producing tons of force really fast, he didn't accelerate better than everyone else. But once he got to top speed, once it was like the longest, most elastic strides, he was able to stay there and cover so much distance so fast for so long because of his build. That was how he won races. But he wasn't going to win a 10-yard dash against other people. You know what I mean? Other people built very differently than him. Wider rib cages, able to compress better, shorter limbs. Like, that works better in really short spaces. That's where a lot of NFL players do shine. But at the longer distances, running a 40-yard dash is a little bit different than running a 20-yard dash. 60-yard dash, 100 meters, etc. Those are all going to have different implications. So it's just some things to think about. It's also worth noting that if you do have long limbs, by nature, it's really important that you do some strength and conditioning. Basketball players are notorious because the sport biases people with a certain build so much due to the rule set and the nature of basketball. People with these really long limbs are so vulnerable in that sport to knee and ankle injury because they're always beating them up. It's the practice schedule and the way they're built, and they don't like to lift usually. It's even more important that you do something to build the strength of the joints up so they can tolerate the beatings that they're going to get from practice and games. So if you are a long-limbed guy, it's even more important that you're really smart about getting stronger, and instead of getting frustrated by the gym and saying, I hate the gym, it hurts me, it bothers me, etc., but if you're also getting hurt from practice, like, you need to find a way around that. Good coaching, smart coaching with the right answers, that's like what you need to do. Obviously, if shorter limbs, same thing, but the standards are even higher for you. Like, you need to get really, really good at it, so you can leverage what compression abilities you have naturally and get even faster to make up for the expansion abilities that these long, narrow guys have. Also, I think what we were talking about was differences in like fight tactics. That's technically where we were coming from when I mentioned the DK Metcalf thing. So a few things I'll just touch on since we were talking about fight tactics earlier. A lot of people also get discouraged by people having longer limbs, thinking a reach advantage is just going to dominate them. That's not true. People just don't understand how they work. And once again, like I mentioned with tall guys, long range guys applying short-limbed guys' weightlifting strategies and programs to themselves not working. It's the same thing with short-limbed guys applying long-limbed guys' fight tactics and strategy to themselves as, like, quote, boxing fundamentals, and you have to do it this way, and it not working, and then saying, well, yeah, my reach isn't long enough to win. And it's like, you're right. Your reach isn't long enough to win that way. But you'll actually be a way better striker and dominate this guy who's taller and longer than you if you just fight differently. So the things you want to think about if you're the shorter limbed guy or a shorter guy in general, exploit the weaknesses that come with the person being taller or longer. They have a longer surface of targets, which means that they have horrible angles to defend themselves with. Once you're close enough and in range to hit them, it is way more distance for them to block their face and their body. They have to move their guard way further to protect both targets. So you can take advantage of this by mixing up the combinations between the two, creating double attacks between the two so they don't know which area to defend all at once. One that I was talking about and shared with a buddy of mine on Twitter the other day, and he got back to me and it worked like a charm, is using a straight right hand to the body more, because it's usually very open, especially on a tall, long guy, especially in MMA, and stabbing that into the gut. You'll be able to fold a lot of tall guys in half like that, and then pairing that with an overhand that looks the same. So once you've established that right hand to the body, throw an overhand that looks just like you're throwing a right hand to the body like you did prior, but whip it over the top. And what you've done is you created an attack that looks the same in its initiation. The telegraph looks the same, but you can't distinguish whether you have to now block way down low. You know, for a tall guy, it's way further down. They have to bring their arm and forearm way lower to parry or block the shot to their sternum. Or they have to bring their guard way up high because this looping shot is going to come over their guard. And it's harder for them to see it because they're usually looking down at you. So if they jab and they go to hit you, this is another thing too. There's a lot of visual blind spots and disadvantages to punching down. You don't want this because if you punch up as the shorter guy, you're actually protected by your own arm and shoulder. So you can actually throw jabs and throw straight shots, and your head is a little bit more protected from the sides, especially if you dip and slip your head side to side. I think that's a really valuable thing for shorter guys to do. Get off center from the straight line targets by laterally shifting and getting lateral angles on them, and force them to use more looping shots against you in order to land, and they'll land on the guard as you throw straight shots cutting down the center line. And that'll also make their shots slower because they're going to loop around, longer distance to travel, versus yours are coming straight towards them. So you get a much bigger speed advantage there. And then it's often blind for them because they're looking down at the limbs where the shot's either coming straight into their gut from the straight right hand in this case, and an overhand looping over the top. So you have different angles that everything's coming at from them that they can look at, and that's terrible. And often what happens is their own gloves or hands are in the way to look down because our gloves are usually right below our eyes. So in order to look down, their own gloves are blocking where your hands and gloves are. So they either lose a half second of noticing what you're going to throw, or they lower their own hands or move their hands out of an advantageous defensive position in order to just see you better, which you can exploit as well. Once you get into range, by the way, you should watch that dealing with a reach advantage video that I made a couple weeks ago in order to kind of understand some of these things a little bit better. You should watch that. You'll get a good example of Alex Volkanovski leveraging stuff like this, and also why reach isn't the same thing as range. Those are two different things. And but one thing is, if you're the shorter limbed guy, you also are able to cycle combination strikes much faster because getting full extension and retraction is a shorter distance for you. So stringing together 2 to 3 to 4 strikes is easier for you, and again advantageous because you want to mix up those areas of attack, because an advantage you have is a taller guy struggles to get his guard in place to defend multiple strikes. So using the fact that you can do it quickly and cycle faster than them through combinations of strikes, take advantage of that as well. Not to mention the fact that it's actually, as much as people say, well, you know, the person can hit you harder from far away because you can't reach them. That's true, but they also lose that power up close because shots work best at their peak distance, which is not just a distance of effect. There's the distance of no effect when it's too far away, and then there's the distance of there's the range of mitigated effect, where a straight jab, straight right hand don't work very well if someone's 3 inches from your face. You can't accelerate and produce force. But you might be in your range to throw a really solid right hand, but they might be a little bit too close, and it's a little too claustrophobic for them to throw one with any power. So keep that in mind as well. And again, punching downwards a nightmare because they are going to punch down at you to counter, which is going to expose their face so much more than what's happening with you. And there's also the massive speed cost, like I just mentioned, where they can't cycle combinations or complete a single strike as quickly, but there's an energy management cost that comes with that as well. Just like how a longer limbed strike or athlete has to do more work to complete one rep of a bench press. They also have to do more work just to complete one jab and one kick in some capacity if they're going to extend it much further. And when they have to do things like change levels, so like say you're shooting on them or you're attacking low limbs, if you're wrestling with them and they have to come down and sprawl and put underhooks in you, they often have to change levels way further to do that. You can really gas them out. Getting them to have to bend their legs and get down to your height and level, that's a nightmare for them down the line. So just like people invest in body shots and leg kicks, it can also be good to invest in takedown fakes and a little bit of cage wrestling and shots that you don't commit too hard to, just because you force them to have to work harder to defend the takedown than you actually did trying to seize it when you really weren't pushing that hard for it. So those are just some things to think about. And I know I'm digressing. I'm spending way too much time going down this list of things, but it's something I do think is interesting to think about and worth discussing on the podcast because I love this topic. But we'll move on just because I've been ranting about it for too long. But hopefully that at least gave you some random insight into things to think about with anthropometry. At some point, I'll do more discussions on it. All right, so Anthony Montez asks, what is an effective exercise to improve reflexes in striking other than sparring? I don't think anything is going to improve your... First of all, reaction time and reflexes are not the same thing. So you can do some things that potentially might be able to help reaction time in general. People like to do these like tennis ball drills or those machines that have like random lights that you have to tag to see how quickly you can react to different mental tasks and cognitive tasks. I don't think things like that are useless in all contexts. But generally, a lot of pro fighters that are getting tons of practice, it's not really making a big difference or useful, a good use of their time in their case. Like if you have someone that is training generally and not getting a ton of sport practice and drilling and whatever, they're just training for their health and well-being and performance as they age, maybe that's a good thing for like general population members a little bit, or like aging athletes in their 50s, 60s, 70s. Like that could be cool, 40s even. But if you are actively competing or training, the best thing is actually just playing the sport. I mean, nothing's going to improve your reflexes better than actually just training the reflexes for the task itself. And your reflex is different from reaction time because reaction time is how quickly your brain goes through an Odo loop and just reacts to some sort of visual or a physical stimuli. And reflexes are the actual action that you took in response to the physical task. So you'll work on reflexes by drilling. Like that's the number one thing by far. You want to eventually load up those drills. If it's not full live sparring, load up those drills so they have some cognitive loading behind it, which means, you know, live drills. It might not be full sparring, but force yourself to actually have to respond live to unexpected and not fully predictable actions, and slowly, progressively overload that by making them less predictable and harder for you to respond to. And that's how you're actually going to improve it. So drilling, by far, there's no other magical exercises. There's no tennis ball exercise that I'm going to give you that's going to be as good as actually just drilling pad work and doing actionable sparring drills. That being said, live full sparring is good, but sometimes it's not the best way to fully develop these skills. You actually want an intermediate action, which is this progression from learning a technique to full sparring. And there's a middle ground as how you progress in between there. I'm going to cover that on Substack. Can one develop mental toughness, or do some people just have it and others don't? Good question. I think you can absolutely develop mental toughness. But I will say that when you see guys that are really tough, that comes from people who went through extreme hardship and they were not able to escape it. Because you will always push through things and learn to cope with stress. And that's ultimately what mental toughness is. It's learning to cope with stress and the impulse to quit. You will always push that harder if you do not have the option to leave the room than somebody who always has the option to press a button and leave. You know, so, and what I'm referring to essentially is people who grew up really tough, grew up with real struggle, they tend to just be a little bit more capable at coping with these issues than someone who grew up, obviously you want to live a good life and you want a good life for your kids, but there is some level of like, the irony is when you live a comfortable, happy life, it's harder for you to deal with the ugliest of situations in many cases because, simply put, you're not as used to coping with them as someone else. And you haven't found out your own personal strategies. And everyone's different. Like, everyone has different places they go to, things they think about, things that motivate them, and things that make them who they are that they use in those instances. That's too various and too abstract to really like put your thumb on. So I think some people have this stuff because they grew up in poverty. They grew up in a real struggle. They grew up with something that gave them a drive and gave them the skills and the capacity, intuitively or consciously, to cope with serious pain and struggle and hardship. And while you can train these things and you can push somebody and you can do things to drill this and develop it in someone, the guy is always going to progressively overload his mental toughness throughout his life when he's like, well, I don't even get to leave the table. I don't get to leave this room. I have to stay in it, which means I had to learn to cope with even the worst of the worst. Versus the guy who has the option to press the button and leave. There's a point where he's going to press that button and leave. You're always going to, if you have the button, you're always going to press it sooner than the guy who literally can't, obviously. So if you literally can't, that person had no choice but to be even tougher than you ever thought was possible. And the person that pushed themselves as hard as they could, they just did that. They pushed themselves as hard as they could until they couldn't. One thing I'll relate to that with is I'm very grateful for the things that I did have in life, but I didn't have a lot of things in life compared to, I was lacking a lot of things in life compared to some of my peers. And I was well aware of that, and it made life a little bit harder for me, or a lot harder at times. And sometimes people would try and give me or someone like me that we were friends with advice on things. And you could just tell when they were connecting with you that it's like, man, you don't quite get how all these things add up and what this is really like. Maybe their heart's in the right place, but it's one of those things where like you've taken a vacation in like a painful place, right? But for some other people, they're not taking a vacation. Like that's where they live or die, and they don't get to leave. And those people are always going to be stressed to the point of mental adaptation that is so far beyond you that you couldn't do it in practice unless you're like an insane person. And most people aren't. So usually, man, these mental toughness drills and things you do to build mental toughness, like there's things you can do to get a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable. But at the end of the day, the guy who grew up with absolutely nothing and like some dude from like a war-torn country that had nothing but like rabbit skin to live off of his childhood, like good luck against that dude, bro. Anyway, so what do you believe are the most essential exercises for a competitive MMA athlete to incorporate? I don't believe there are any essential exercises for an MMA athlete to incorporate besides MMA drilling and skill drilling and sparring and the traditional technical skill work that you need to get good. In terms of strength and conditioning, I don't think that it's any different than what all physical specimens and athletes need, which are just, you need to be able to get the entire body strong. You need some form of squatting or knee extension, some form of, hinging or hip extension. You need to train the lower leg. You need to train the hands, elbows, shoulder flexion and extension through the arms. And you need to train, I think, in contact sports. And I mentioned this in the structure types video lecture on YouTube from last year. Can't believe that was a year ago now. But in that, if you're an acceleration heavy type structure that you're aiming for, you need to be strong and muscular from head to toe. So that means the grip and the forearms need to also be strong, and so does the neck. So those are also essential to train. But in terms of like sports specific exercises, if that's what you're getting at, I don't really believe in those things. I'll also mention, by the way, when people talk about like sport-specific exercises, and it's like, this is specific to this action, whatever. Those things usually are not good developmental exercises at all and don't really, give you a good bang for your buck. But what often happens is people incorporate them and then they feel really good. They feel like this one worked for me and I felt very strong. I felt very potentiated, and they get all up in arms about it. And it's like, that's exactly what it is. You feel potentiated from it. You felt like you did this special sport-specific exercise and it helped potentiate your nervous system to produce higher outputs in a similar action, which we usually do before competition. So that's why those special exercises are used to peak you and potentiate you before competition. But that's not something that's actually going to develop your baseline. That's the top of the pyramid that gives you a peak before competition. The baseline that actually builds the base of the pyramid and makes the real difference long term are the pretty standard basic things that everyone wants to get good at. So I don't really believe that athletes need super specific essential exercises for their sport. It's individual human bodies need certain setups, exercises, and training accommodations for their goals based on their body type and then their constraints, whether it's their health, sport practice, lifestyle, schedule, etc., and also their skill set. That's really what you want to look at when you're thinking about what exercises I need for MMA. When you do those sport-specific exercises that people say, you feel good for 2 or 3 weeks maybe on them, but if you do them for a year, you're not going to notice any improvement. But the guy who added 150 pounds to his front squat compared to you just being like, all I did was this banded punch drill and banded, takedown shots all year, and, you both equally trained your skills, that guy who got his front squat up 150 pounds is going to fold you. Regan asks, there's already a grappling system developed in martial arts, John Danaher's defensive BJJ, but nothing for striking sports. Do you think it's possible to develop a striking system, or is it impossible? Also, city kickboxing's feinting can be considered a system. I don't think that... So it depends what you mean by system, because are we talking about a comprehensive system for striking itself? Are we talking about a comprehensive system for striking in a certain context, striking in MMA, or fighting in general? And then it's like, you can have systems or subsystems, like maybe city kickboxing's feinting, style. Maybe you can consider that a system if it is. They have a feinting system, right? But I don't know if we would say that's their entire striking system, right? So I think it first comes down to defining what a system is. A system to me is a series of protocols and options that you take, that you have defined, that you would use in certain situations pre-planned out in order to create an outcome or raise the likelihood of an outcome. Or there's also the flip side of this, is that's an execution of the system. Like when you're actually performing and striking, there's also a system of teaching. So like, what are the protocols and decisions that we make when trying to put this skill set into the athlete? And that's a very different thing too. So I probably can't even really answer this on here. I'd have to do our own podcast where I organize this, honestly, because I think it really does it. I have a post on Substack that's like 70% done on skill acquisition. So I'll cover some of that stuff on there and you'll gain some insight in my opinion. But I'll say that when it comes to the execution of striking, temperament is also a big factor, because some people have different ways of thinking about things and acting and what works for them in terms of their mental approach to some such things. So for example, some people are very systematized in the first place, where they are like, well, I want a flow chart system, and that's basically what a system is. In a lot of cases, it's like a flow chart of progressions and decisions that you make under certain contexts. Someone like Demetrius Johnson, very flow chart type fighter, right? Like he's like, okay, I'm in this situation, I have options A, B, C, and D. If I choose option C, I'll have sub options A, B, C, and D, and then he can kind of reverse engineer how to get to a better position and probably win from there, like 3 iterations down. And so he does that really well, and dominates people in fights because he's able to think a couple steps ahead, get himself into a good position, continuously getting himself into better positions, and then winning. And he has that flowchart system in his head, and with Matt Hume, the way they organized and executed their plans for fights. But then you have someone that is not like that at all, and what they're doing is working, and you'd probably ruin them if you tried to take that away from them. So an example of that might be like Tony Ferguson in his prime. Like, that dude wasn't coming in with flow charts in his head. He's literally in a flow state in his head, getting after it, solving problems on the fly as he's there with tactics and techniques that he's intuitively figuring out or he's practiced and drilled prior. But if you give him the flow chart system, I don't think that would work with him personally. I wouldn't have coached him that way. So what he's doing is more intuitive versus what DJ was doing, I think, is more structured. So you have some intuitive athletes and more structured athletes. Further examples for that might, and obviously this is a spectrum, and they both exhibit qualities between both archetypes, but I think the quintessential structured athlete archetype when it comes to MMA is George St. Pierre, and the quintessential intuitive one was Anderson Silva. But at the same time, George was figuring some things out on the fly and, flowing, and Silva did have things he pre-planned and structured out prior. Like, it's not like these things don't exist in their plan at all. But I think they're really good examples of the classic structured versus intuitive athlete. I've tweeted about that before. But yeah, in terms of building systems, there's different things we're talking about. There's a learning system, a coaching system, and then there's an execution system. And I think it's absolutely possible to build a striking system. I've been kind of working, and I've been grappling with this my whole life, ultimately, because I'm such a structured, I want a system type person. I'm so flowcharty. I've actually tried to I've tried to deliberately make myself more intuitive because I think I'm so much of a flowchart type person, analytical type, that it's actually been a deficit for me. It's in a detriment. But I think you absolutely can do it. It's just more difficult because I think that there's actually less. So BJJ just has more moves that can happen that are their own moves and their own maneuver. There's less of those in striking in general. So the way the system is built and designed and executed and then taught there's differences because of that. Because you're really working with something that's more like, you could, depending on how you look at it, you could look at it between striking as 15 to 50 moves and micro variations on that. And then BJJ is hundreds of maneuvers that are very specific. So, yeah, I'll do my own post on that, but I really think the biggest part of a proper system is the way it's installed into the person rather than having a specific flowchart answer for everything, because not everyone's built like that. What is a good way for combat sports athlete to add some positive size without losing athleticism or burst and without getting too fat? What kind of program would you recommend? So obviously I recommend to you the Combat Ready program on Substack. Just because that's the template. Obviously everyone that works with me has a customized approach that based on a lot of factors, but the general template that we kind of look at and start with some fairly good ideas is the Combat Ready one. With combat sports, it kind of depends also on if you're competitive or not. So if you're competitive, you have a busy schedule, things are going to be very different than if you're casually training. So if you're casually training and you don't have weight cuts and competitions you have to make weight for, you can just bulk whenever you want. And the key to not getting fat is to just have a reasonable calorie surplus that's not too excessive, and to also eat enough protein and sleep enough and train in such a way that you actually gain muscular size. So what I would do with competitive athletes, and this is what I do, is we will use their off-camp season in between fights, because you don't have a long off season like football players do. Instead, if you have a fight and you finish, or a tournament competition, right after that, we will rest up and then go right into like a general physical preparation structure building phase, and just try and get you as big and strong as possible if we think that that's something that we want to work on. This is usually for younger guys that are not as physically developed. And the way you maintain athleticism and burst while doing that is that you're also concurrently training other athletic qualities in burst. I've talked about this prior a million times, but I don't think gaining muscle in 99% of cases is what slows people down. It's the lack of doing things that are fast that slows them down. So just have a reasonable calorie surplus. Use the time that you have off camp to gain a little bit of size, but don't bulk on the way up to a fight within 8 weeks. That's probably not a good idea. You want at least 5 to 10 weeks of settling into your weight and preparing. You don't want to spend that time trying to, get big and build your biceps. All right, so that's the end of the questions for this week. It's a long podcast, but I wanted to get everything done here, and it's been about 6 weeks since the last one. So if you made it this far, appreciate you guys. The last thing I'll actually mention with that last question is if you are interested in something, I'm probably going to put the updated variations of the Combat Ready program and the hybrid program on the app, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So if you are interested in that, you don't have to commit, but if you are interested, you can always message me and you'll be able to see what's up. I'll give you a tour of what we're doing when it comes out. And the goal is really to just give you guys, this is the culmination of everything that I've been working towards, in my opinion, for the last 2 years. I've really been trying to refine it. I've been working really hard on practicing, implementing this stuff, refining it, working out the kinks, and getting it really working well with my individual one-on-one clients until I find something and have found something that I think is going to work really well at scale. So it'll be really fun. I think it's awesome to build a community here around a program like this, and eventually it'll be 2 programs and that you can choose from. And yeah, I'm really excited to do this, and I also really appreciate all of you guys, those of you that listen to these long podcasts, read all these posts. I get a lot of tremendous feedback from you guys, and it sounds, cliche and stupid, but genuinely, man, it's been surreal, some of the stuff you guys have said and the support you've given me, and it's really changed my life. It's allowed me to do something I truly love, and so far pay my bills with it. So I couldn't ask for anything better. So I appreciate all you guys. I'm saying all this because I'm ready to really kick things into a new gear for this next year, because for me, I just passed the 2-year anniversary of the Hybrid Athlete online stuff, and I've been reflecting on that. So for me, it's my 3rd year beginning here in this sphere, and this Hybrid 2.0 program, the Hybrid Elite Performance Program, this is going to be my baby here, and I really want it to be the most amazing thing you can possibly find on social media for a group training program, and I'm excited to release it. So stay tuned. I'll make a formal announcement to everyone else who didn't listen to the podcast shortly, but for now, if you did listen to this and you're interested, message me like I mentioned at the beginning, and we'll get started. Thanks, guys. Cheers.